بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I wanted to take this opportunity to first thank every single person in this audience and thank the organizers of this event, both within MINA and ISNA, for putting this together because of the importance of retreats such as this, the importance of taking a step back from our regular lives to confer with the scholars and the knowledgeable people and learn from them to actually rejuvenate our faith. Those reminders have kept up Muslims within this country that is not a profoundly Muslim one to remain on their deen for years to come. And when it comes to remaining on their deen, we have to look towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first and foremost. When it comes to the rope of Allah, the strength of connection that we have with Him, we must attempt to maintain it at all times. And events like this are key and critical to that. Oftentimes, many of us are separated from the cultures that led us into Islam. The vast majority of this audience grew up Muslim, and with every generation, unlike 30 to 40 years ago when ISNA and MINA were in their founding stages, it becomes harder and harder to reconnect with our faith, to reconnect with the culture that led us into our faith. And so what I wanted to share with you guys today was simply just a few reminders about the connection to Allah that I took in when leaving MINA, when departing these spiritual retreats and heading back home to attempt to practice to the best of my ability at home. As you would have heard in Brother Zain's wonderful introduction, I don't have any particular deen qualifications, only what I learned from MINA and from the scholars like the ones who are speaking before and after me. So I wanted to give you just these three tidbits as to how we can actually rekindle and maintain that connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These three attributes of the rope of Allah that allow us to continue to maintain our connection. These three attributes are firstly, the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself, His consistency and His mercy. Secondarily, our outlook on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and us understanding all of those attributes. And finally, understanding the nature of this life and the nature of the challenges that Mufti Abdullah was covering in his last speech. The fact of the matter is we are always going to face challenges and we always have to be ready to do them for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Covering on the first point, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has many attributes, but the first two we are all introduced to, and the two I said at the beginning of the speech today, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, mostly translated as the most gracious and the most merciful. Understanding these two attributes is key to maintaining the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Oftentimes, people will take upon hardships and despair in them, thinking that it is a punishment or thinking that it is retribution of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for some sin they committed. Not only is it just human to commit sins, it's important to understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forgive everything, except for shirk on the face of death. Every other sin imaginable that you may have committed, no matter in what circumstance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is willing to forgive as long as you give sincere repentance. There are many other traits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we must continue to affirm, but these two are most important. In order to understand our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we also have to understand the difference between a relationship with Him and a relationship with any other being or thing around us. While we do have strong family relationships or friendly relationships with people who help to maintain our faith, they compare nothing to the relationship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will always be the most consistent, will always answer our prayers, and will always be there for us no matter what. Secondarily, it's also important to understand when it comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that specifically with His attributes, oftentimes we can get garnered into a misunderstanding. Just as Mufti Abdullah was talking about earlier, we can often misunderstand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as expecting us to suck in all of our punishments. And we oftentimes will despair in them. And I know I've seen examples of this time and time again. We have communities that have grieved from the loss of young brothers like myself, young brothers as young as 13 years old, including some who passed just this recently in my community. It's hard to maintain ourselves within these circumstances and within these trials. So it's important to understand the reason why we exist in this world. This world is not our eternal home. The paradise of Jannah is. And to reach the paradise of Jannah, we have to go through strict trials and tribulations that some of us may not have hit yet, especially the younger group in the crowd. But this life was never meant to be easy. We will all face extreme challenges. We will all be called to question for those challenges on the Day of Judgment. But if you perform within expectation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with the understanding that you will not be punished for what you do or for the mistakes you commit, as long as you reach out, you will be able to overcome these strict trials and tribulations. I know many of the youth themselves have taken the lead on this and have experienced this recently. As we've seen with the protests in the past year carried out by Muslims and non-Muslims alike, they were thrown in the face of a ridiculous media attack on many of them. They were thrown in the face of pressures from the universities that canceled degrees, and universities that simply maintained the legacy of oppression that the Israeli lobby continues to foment within the US. And it's the charge of the youth to simply continue to stand in the trials of these tribulations, and the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only thing that will make it easier. It is the only thing that can maintain them through it, and is the only thing that can keep them successful on it. I know what I saw within my own family in the past year when this happened. My own sister was in the face of this own media barrage, and I saw how hard it was on her. Those simple trials and tribulations cannot be responded to by any sort of rational thinking that does not include Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We must include Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every trial and tribulation we face, because without it we will be unable completely to overcome them at any point in our lives. These are simply just the platitudes that I have learned from Mina and learned from our many events throughout the years that I've attempted to maintain to keep up with my own faith. It's incredibly difficult within this country in order to do so. We're faced by more distractions than ever before, more fitna than ever before, and it's hard to keep us protected from them in any sort of complete way. However, an understanding of the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only way to do it, and it is for that reason that I repeated all of these simple platitudes that I have learned from today. We stand in a deeply negative world around us, but this is the way that we are able to maintain our faith and insha'Allah join the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Jannah one day. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.